My general rule since the dawn of the Trump presidency, and even going back well before that, is to not react impulsively to every Trump tweet. And there are numerous reasons for that, one of which being that it gives into his preferred communications framing. And it satisfies his urges to be the master of the news cycle, where you can't help but get into a flutter about every little thought that he decides to put out into the world in tweet size form. However, there are exceptions occasionally, and usually those exceptions, at least for my purpose, are when you can take whatever he's blurted out and make a larger thematic point based on it. And that applies to his outburst over the weekend having to do with the squad of Democratic Congresswomen who draw so much disproportionate media attention and also draw disproportionate consternation from their adversaries, both within the Democratic Party and also, obviously, among Republicans and conservatives and Trump. So what he said, as you will undoubtedly have seen, and if you haven't, I actually envy you, because what's the point, really? But what he said was that these congresswomen should, quote, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. Now, in order to actually take that comment seriously and try to understand what his meaning is, you have to go through and determine which places he could possibly be referring to, because as many people have pointed out, 3 of the 4 women in question were born in the United States. The one who was not was Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who was born in Somalia and came to the United States as a young person. The only conceivable other place that Trump could be referring to is with respect to Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, who, although was born in the United States, is of Palestinian ancestry. And with respect to the other two, AOC, I mean, she was born in the U.S. and she's Puerto Rican, so what could that possibly mean in terms of a foreign place? And Ayanna Pressley is just Black American, whose ancestors have been in the United States longer than Trump's. So you have to just isolate it to, I guess, Somalia and Palestine. So that's what I'll do here briefly to show why there are some broader points that could be made. First of all, Somalia. Somalia, yes, is a war-torn country, very unstable, riven by long-standing civil conflict and strife. But the way Trump seems to talk about it is as if these conditions just materialize out of thin air. On the contrary, the United States is a combatant in the warlike situation that is currently bedeviling Somalia and has for a very long time. Trump actually issued a decree early in his presidency characterizing officially Somalia as effectively a war zone, and that the ordinary laws of war apply to U.S. conduct in Somalia. So there have been a substantial increase in airstrikes in Somalia since Trump's assuming of office. This had begun in the late stages of the Obama administration, but Trump has ramped it up. So the idea that you can talk about Somalia as if it's crime infested and totally broken civil infrastructure is just taking place in a vacuum without any U.S. involvement totally obscures the actual nature of the situation, not surprisingly. Whether Trump himself is even aware that the U.S. has intensified its military engagement in Somalia is an open question, but his administration is sure aware because they've been orchestrating it. So there was a New York Times article in March of this year which talked about this increase in hostilities in Somalia, and it quoted a former National Security Council official in the Trump administration. Her name is Brittany Brown, who said, quote, "People need to pay attention to the fact that there is this massive war going on," end quote. And let me just underscore that the U.S. is a combatant in that war. She added that the war in Somalia appears to be, quote, on autopilot. And the authors of the New York Times piece note that the war is drawing the United States significantly deeper into an armed conflict without much public debate. Gee, who would have thought? It's not as if that's basically how every U.S. armed conflict has come about, with the exception of a few where there was an outright invasion, such as Iraq in 2003, although there were precedents in terms of U.S. involvement in Iraq dating back well before 2003. But at least as of this New York Times article, there were 500 troops stationed in Somalia, American troops. Were you aware of that? Did you participate in any public debate relating to that troop deployment? Are you aware of what the strategy is pertaining to those U.S. troops? What objectives do they have? What is the end goal? Or is this just an open-ended conflict and another fruitless attempt by the U.S. to engage in counterinsurgency tactics against a homegrown group in Somalia, in this case Al-Shabaab, which, yes, does have radical beliefs and is disdained by significant sections of the Somali population, but nevertheless arises from the existing conditions within that country and can't simply be eradicated by an airstrike here or a training mission there. In fact, a U.S. soldier, did you know this? Probably not, was killed in Somalia in June of 2018, but because these types of interventions are so commonplace, they hardly provoke any public interest at all. And I'm not even exempting myself necessarily from that, because it's not as if I pay especially close attention to what's happening in Somalia on a day-to-day basis, partly because there's so much U.S. military force projected the world over that one person can't really follow it all, and unless they're a specialist in a particular zone, such as Somalia. But even the U.S. military leadership, which has domain over Somalia, they have publicly testified that these recurring airstrikes in Somalia are not going to, quote, defeat Al-Shabaab, which is now riven by its own internal conflicts. There are some within Al-Shabaab who have declared fidelity to Al-Qaeda, others to ISIS. Because we don't have a great amount of on-the-ground information with regard to those internal conflicts, there are probably other kind of sub-factions that have other varying interests that we're not even really aware of. And here's what General Thomas Waldhauser said earlier this year to the Senate Armed Services Committee. He said, quote, "At the end of the day, these strikes aren't going to defeat al-Shabaab." Gee, who would have imagined that? The latest airstrike in Somalia that's been publicly reported by AFRICOM, which is the command established by George W. Bush that oversees U.S. military actions in Africa, many of which are just totally obscure and unknown even to most U.S. politicians who are serving in Congress. You remember in 2017 when there was an incident in Niger when several U.S. troops were killed in an ambush? Most people had no knowledge at all that there were even U.S. troops stationed in Niger. I mean, what are they doing? What is the mission? Who knows, right? That's just the nature of living in really an empire that has so many tentacles in so many places that it's impossible for any citizen or even really any professional journalist to keep track of them all. The latest airstrike in Somalia was June 25th of this year, and according to AFRICOM, it killed one insurgent or terrorist. But of course, these strikes tend to take place in remote rural areas, and they aren't independently verified as to the casualties, so they very easily could be killing civilians, and there's no way to independently confirm the claims of the government or the U.S. government with respect to what the effect of those strikes are. And in 2018, there were 47 strikes, which was a substantial increase from the following year, and we're on pace this year to exceed that total once more. So let's say that at least some of the strikes that have been carried out recently, some of which killed dozens of people, and those are only the figures that are reported by the U.S. military. Let's just assume that 5 or 10% of those casualties are actually civilians, or at least they're not terrorists in a traditionally understood sense. Do we think that that perhaps contributes to the conditions in Somalia where they are crime infested and the government, as Trump put it, is totally broken? Probably. And yet that context gets totally omitted from these discussions. You can go back years for the history of U.S. interventionism in Somalia. Did you know that in December of 2006, George W. Bush helped back an invasion of Somalia by Ethiopia, which then destabilized the government? Gee, who could have thought? And led to additional strife. I mean, people are aware of the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, where dozens of U.S. soldiers were killed out in a supposedly humanitarian mission. But let me give you what the chief of military history in the U.S. Army, Brigadier General John S. Brown, wrote in his summary of that mission in the early 90s. In Somalia, where on ostensibly humanitarian grounds, the U.S. had intervened and there was food obviously airdropped in, as is famously recounted in much of the popular media with respect to that mission. You may have seen the movie Black Hawk Down and such, but here's what John S. Brown said. So this is not some left-wing fringe character, obviously. This is John S. Brown, the Brigadier General in the U.S. Army, Chief of Military History, summarizing the U.S. intervention in Somalia in the early 90s. He says, quote, "Greeted initially by Somalis happy to be saved from starvation, U.S. troops were slowly drawn into inter-clan power struggles and ill-defined nation-building missions. The American people woke up one day in early October 1993 to news reports of dozens of our soldiers killed or wounded in fierce fighting in the streets in the capital city of Mogadishu. Now, if the U.S. had purely humanitarian motives, how could it possibly be in a situation where it would provoke that kind of blowback such that citizens were taking up arms against the U.S. military presence there? It's because it wasn't a purely humanitarian mission. It was, as usual, the assertion of dominance by a hegemonic power in a region that has a lot of unique commercial importance in terms of the sea passageways and also various natural resources that U.S. corporations are interested in maintaining. And you can go back further. I mean, during the Cold War in the 70s and 80s, Somalia was sort of a pawn between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for them to exert their own interests. And shockingly, that helped to precipitate a civil war, which is what led to Ilhan Omar seeking refuge in the U.S. to begin with. So it's not as if you can blame every single problem in Somalia on U.S. foreign policy. But U.S. foreign policy is obviously a factor. And to totally negate that in any discussion of why that country has problems is incredibly myopic and is further evidence that the U.S., as a matter of practice, tries to keep obscure its role around the world from the general population, because if the general population were more aware of it, they probably would think to themselves, this really doesn't make any sense, and they would call for a rescission of that global presence. Now, with respect to Palestine, which again probably isn't even worth mentioning in the same breath as Somalia because Rashida Tlaib is not born in Palestine. Nonetheless, Palestine is the most obvious example, perhaps, of the U.S. state weighing in overwhelmingly on the side of one party to a conflict, that being Israel, which has kept Palestine under military occupation since the 1960s, over 50 years. And is there a corruption within the governing authority in the West Bank? Yes. Are there problems within the Gaza Strip that you can't automatically attribute to the United States? Sure, but from a broader perspective, you have to acknowledge, or else you are ridiculous, that the U.S. has basically given Israel everything it wants with regard to its subjugation of those two territories, and sends it arms, sends it military aid, etc., diplomatic cover. So the notion of simply looking at any problem that's endemic to Gaza or the West Bank as separate and apart from U.S. policy, again, is just sheer ignorance. And I'm not expecting Trump to necessarily capture all that in the context of one tweet storm, but you would think it would at least be noted in the subsequent coverage of that tweet storm, and generally it has not been. Because most of the people in the media are ignorant to foreign affairs. It's not their bailiwick. They tend to become like overnight experts when there's one hot spot somewhere in the world. I'm not claiming I'm the leading authority on every U.S. military intervention, but I do at least try to be cognizant of it, or more cognizant relative to the median media member. So that, I think, is worth emphasizing, at least from my vantage point. And then, of course, Trump followed it up today with arguably an even more ridiculous statement when he said, quote, "When will the radical left congresswoman apologize to our country?" Capitals. He capitalized the word country because That's what he does. The people of Israel, and even the office of the president, for the foul language they have used, blah, blah, blah. So he's saying, why don't these congresswomen apologize to Israel? Now, one thing the Trump fandom said in defense of the comments was, oh my God, this is just the expression of Trump's really deeply felt nationalism. And therefore, it's part of the whole America First agenda for him to be telling these U.S. congresswomen to go back to their countries. And yet, Trump is explicitly stating here that part of his motivation is to avenge the supposedly hurt feelings of Israel. Trump says that the people of Israel feel that the United States is abandoning them because of the supposedly offensive comments of these congresswomen. Now, if it's true that the people of Israel are so deeply unnerved by Ilhan Omar that they feel that the United States is abandoning them, who's to blame for that other than Trump? Trump is the one who's presiding over a government who has been unbelievably obsequious to Israel, given them everything that they wanted, even more so than the Obama administration, which was obsequious in its own way, taken all these symbolic gestures, such as moving the embassy to Jerusalem, increasing military aid, penalizing the Palestinian Authority in various ways. So if the people of Israel could somehow feel that they are being abandoned by the United States simply because of a stray comment or two by one freshman member of Congress, then that, I think, ought to be blamed on Trump. He's the one who's running the executive branch and has almost unilateral authority over these decisions. And of course, Trump is just trying to whip up culture war furor. That's one of his only core competencies. And he knows I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Trump. I know that's kind of a fool's errand, but one of the core duties of the presidency, as he sees it, which is, this is pretty obvious, is to get involved in every kind of inflammatory dispute that has a culture war dimension, and try to use that to, galvanize his supporters into political action. And he does that because the voters, which tipped him over the edge in 2016, haven't really been given the material benefits that they might have anticipated from a Trump administration, given his rhetoric in 2016, so he has to kind of compensate for that by sending them daily doses of culture war red meat. It's a common tactic. It's nothing new, but obviously it takes a peculiar form with Trump, and he wants to elevate these people as foils, meaning the members of Congress. Whereas, in terms of political strategy, generally, the electorate reacts to the record of the incumbent president more so than a random handful of members of Congress. So that strategy may not serve Trump's purposes as much as he may think. Anyway, those are my thoughts for the day. If you find yourself appreciating anything I put out on YouTube or Twitter or articles or podcasts or anything, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Consider giving a contribution through PayPal. The links are in the description box, as always. And that'll do it. Subscribe on YouTube as well. And I'll talk to you later.